Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Hillbilly Highway, the Transappalachian Migration and the Making of a White Working Class, by Max Fraser, narrated by Lyle Blaker. Introduction. A pioneering piece of cultural anthropology by the husband and wife team of Robert and Helen Lind may have made Muncie, Indiana, the most famous middle town in all of America. But a half-century earlier, it was a local driller named A.H. Cronell who first put the small Midwestern city on the map. In October 1886, Cronell sunk a bore into the belt of limestone that runs across much of the central and eastern portions of Indiana, and struck gas 922 feet below the town of Eaton. When he lit a flame to the well, it rose 10 feet in the air, and could be seen all the way to Muncie, a dozen miles to the south. The fiery beacon drew admiring crowds for weeks afterward, and then, for years, industry, jobs, and people. The Eaton well was the first commercially viable natural gas well drilled in the state, and it announced the coming of a gas boom to east-central Indiana that lasted more than a decade and transformed the region for much longer than that. The Trenton gas field stretched from western Ohio to around Kokomo, Indiana, 45 miles northwest of Muncie. At roughly 5,000 square miles, it was the largest known gas field in the world at the time, and with the bonanza came all the familiar signs of a gold rush. New drilling companies and boosterish boards of trade were hastily organized across the 11-county region, which historically had been home to sedate county seats and some of the richest farmland in the state. A real estate frenzy saw land prices increase as much as threefold in Muncie and surrounding cities like Anderson, Marion, and Kokomo. Muncie's population more than doubled between 1886 and 1890, and then nearly doubled again by 1900, making it the largest city in the Indiana gas belt at the turn of the century. Ultimately, more significant to the future of the region and the gas itself were the new businesses the boom attracted. Producers in heat-intensive industries like iron and glass-making in particular were drawn to the region for its cheap and readily available fuel. In 1880, there were just 4 glass factories in all of Indiana. By 1900, there were 6 in Muncie alone, and 110 across the state. New outfits like the Muncie Natural Gas Land Company, organized in 1889 by a group of Eastern investors and led by a former governor of New Jersey, wooed manufacturing outfits from the coal-burning areas of Pennsylvania and Ohio by providing free land and deeply discounted gas prices. Local businessman James Boyce netted Muncie its most famous catch of the gas boom era when he successfully lured the Buffalo, New York-based fruit jar company Ball Brothers to the city, with an offer of 8 acres of land, $5,000, and the company's own gas well. After the glassmakers and foundries came wire fabricators and bridge builders, and stove part makers and refrigeration companies, and especially automobile parts manufacturers. Long after wasteful drilling practices had tapped out the Trenton field reserves by the second decade of the 20th century, Ball Brothers and the other industrial enterprises that settled in the area would ensure that Muncie's first nickname, the City of Eternal Gas, outlived the boom years that had been its inspiration. Ball Brothers was the first place that Kenny Lewis got a job when he arrived in Muncie in 1942 at the age of 17. Kenny was born in the swampy Delta region of Arkansas, where his father raised cotton, rice, and soybeans on a small piece of land that provided just enough to make a living. A friend had moved up to Muncie a couple years prior and wanted Kenny to join him, and by the time Kenny came of age, it did not require much convincing to get him to leave too. Kenny said, "I just got tired of working in hot fields. And mosquitoes. Mosquitoes was bad down there, with all the water. I didn't want to be a farmer." Muncie's manufacturing economy grew rapidly during the war years, from 16,000 jobs before the defense boom to 25,000 by 1944, and Ball was a prime beneficiary of both wartime rationing, which stimulated demand for the company's ubiquitous flagship product, the Mason canning jar, and new government procurement contracts, after it retooled its Muncie operations to produce shells and machine parts for the military. As demand soared, an acute citywide labor shortage worked in favor of recent migrants like Kenny. "I got up here one day, and I went to work the next day at Ball Brothers." It was not happenstance that Kenny Lewis ended up working at Ball Brothers. Ball had a reputation for hiring Southerners that extended well beyond the Muncie city limits. Many of Kenny's co-workers hailed from Kentucky and Tennessee. Wesley Reagan, who grew up outside of Jamestown, Tennessee, a rural hamlet about 150 miles east of Nashville and a dozen or so miles south of the Kentucky border, remembers being young and hearing older relatives talk about moving north. When they did, it was mainly Ball Brothers that they mentioned. Nor was Ball Brothers the only Muncie employer that looked south when needing to fill workforce demands. During the boom years of the 1920s, local manufacturers brought in so many recruits from the southern Appalachian Mountains that they arranged special trains to deliver them to the city. Companies like Eber Refrigeration, a Muncie firm owned by Tennessee Transplants, often placed job advertisements in local newspapers like the Upper Cumberland Times, published out of Jamestown. Business was so flush during World War II, in fact, that even the luncheonettes were known to take out ads in out-of-state newspapers for waiters, cooks, and dishwashers. The influx of Southern migrants was so great in these years, and during the decades immediately following the war, that a reporter exaggerated only slightly when he noted that the staff of one local employer that hired primarily Kentuckians changes daily. Newcomers stayed only long enough to get a stake, which they could bring back home to their southern places of origin, perhaps to invest in a piece of land or some new machinery on the farm, or until they could find better-paying work locally. Kenny Lewis, for instance, put in 2 years at Ball Brothers, working in the rubber department. But when a job became available at the nearby Chevrolet transmission plant, with pay that started at nearly 10 cents more an hour, he jumped on it, and ended up staying at Chevrolet for the next 3 decades. In the meantime, the makeup of Muncie's population, and especially its working-class population, began to change in ways that drew growing notice, and no small measure of ire from long-time residents. "Have you heard that there are only 45 states left in the Union?" went a joke heard around town with increasing frequency during the years when Kenny first got there, back when Hawaii and Alaska were still only territories. Kentucky and Tennessee have gone to Indiana, and Indiana has gone to hell. Kenny Lewis and Wesley Reagan were just 2 participants in one of the largest population relocations in recent American history. Over the first 3/4 of the 20th century, somewhere around 8 million poor white Southerners, perhaps even more, left economically marginal parts of the southern countryside and traveled north in search of work. Some, like Kenny, came from the swamps of northeastern Arkansas, or from among the same rocky ridgelines of the Cumberland Mountains of East Tennessee that Wesley had called home, and from countless farming communities, mill villages, railroad junctions, and mining camps in between. Most left in the years between World War I and the end of the 1960s, when an array of large-scale economic transformations, from the modernization of agricultural technologies to the intensification of resource-extractive industrialization, combined to make traditional agrarian livelihoods increasingly untenable, and when the resulting disparity in the quality of life in the rural South and the urban industrial North was at its most pronounced. They followed successive waves of relatives, friends, and neighbors who had charted migratory pathways before them, relying on extensive networks of kin and community to navigate far-flung labor markets and secure places to live in unfamiliar and frequently unwelcoming destinations. Some traveled only temporarily, moving back and forth between city and country according to the logic of the seasons or the fluctuations of the business cycle. Many others left the rural South behind for good, bringing with them a set of regionally distinctive experiences and ways of life that conditioned how they settled into their new homes and left an indelible impression on their new urban surroundings. Whatever the case may have been, they journeyed forth on a proliferating network of interstate roadways that would give this massive interregional migration its most abiding nickname, the Hillbilly Highway. Rural white Southerners who left the broad region stretching from the Appalachian mountain ranges to the floodplains of the Mississippi River found their way to every corner of the country over the course of the 20th century. But the majority, by virtue of a combination of geographic propinquity and generational interconnection, headed for the large cities and burgeoning factory towns of the Midwestern manufacturing belt that encircled the Great Lakes. They went to smaller regional centers like Muncie and Dayton, Ohio, where Wesley Reagan ended up, and put in 32 years at one of the 4 General Motors plants in town while raising 4 children with his wife Lula, who he courted during return trips to Tennessee, or to larger cities like Cincinnati, where so many impoverished refugees from the declining Appalachian hinterland eventually settled that local officials began speaking of them as the city's second minority. Or to Chicago, where Southern newcomers gravitated to a working-class area north of the Loop that by the 1950s had become so chock-full of barbecue joints and country music bars that the neighborhood's residents rechristened it Hillbilly Heaven. Or to Detroit, where Southern migrants became so thoroughly associated in the public eye with job competition, slum conditions, and urban disorder that at mid-century more than 1 in 5 city inhabitants selected poor Southern whites as the most undesirable group in the city, with only gangsters and criminals receiving lower popularity ranks. Most rural Southerners arrived in the industrial Midwest with nothing more than what could be scraped together after the fall harvest, or from the sale of the last remaining parcel of family land, or from a final shift at the local mine or sawmill. When the renowned documentary photographer Margaret Bourke White traveled to Muncie on assignment for Life magazine in the spring of 1937, the resulting 11-page photo essay she produced, commissioned to coincide with the publication of Middletown in Transition, the Lynn's follow-up to their best-selling 1929 sensation, included one emblematic photo of a pair of destitute white migrants from Kentucky. Scott and Lizabelle Brandenburg were at the bottom of Muncie's social strata, noted the accompanying caption. Photographed in their home, a one-room clapboard shack in Shedtown, a slum district on Muncie's southwestern fringe, the most notable item of furniture pictured is a homemade brooder next to the bed, in which, as Lizabelle explains, they are raising chickens for eatin' rather than to sell. The Brandenburgs' well-worn work clothes, their weathered hands and faces, the simple metal frame bed on which they sit, eyes averted from the camera all mark them, in Bourke White's composition, as recognizable types. Mrs. Brandenburg talks with the Kentucky hillbilly drawl heard in many Midwest industrial towns, the caption continued, from Southerners migrated north to work in the great auto plants. In the decades to come, Southern migrants like the Brandenburgs would share in the kind of working-class prosperity that jobs in Midwestern factories provided to a generation or two of Americans, and most of all to white industrial workers and their families. Although white Southerners remained disproportionately concentrated in blue-collar jobs throughout the post-war period, by the end of the 1960s the average family income of Southern-born whites living in the Midwest would be roughly equivalent to that of other white residents of the region, and 25% higher by comparison than the incomes of Southern-born African Americans in the Midwest. Similar convergences and disparities marked the progress that Southern white migrants would make when it came to occupational mobility, residential patterns, and other measures of social and economic well-being. Years later, Wesley Reagan would speak with enduring pride of the moment when he and Lula were able to purchase their first home in a working-class subdivision just outside of Dayton, built by a local developer who put up thousands of such homes across central and southwestern Ohio during the 1950s and 60s. A Huber home is what I bought. Huber was the biggest builder of single-dwelling brick homes in the United States, and that goes back many, many years ago. And after 3 decades of paying membership dues to the plant's International Union of Electrical Workers Local, Wesley, who had left Tennessee with barely a penny to his name, would even be able to retire at the relatively young age of 52, with a union pension and company-provided health insurance for the remainder of his and Lula's lives. In other ways, however, Southern white migrants and their families would remain something of a class apart in the urban Midwest throughout much of the 20th century. powerful stereotypes stemming from popular beliefs about the impoverished rural circumstances they came from and the low standards of living to which such hillbillies were accustomed made them widely sought-after recruits by northern employers, and just as widely despised by the urban workers they were hired to work alongside or in place of. The rural accents, styles of dress, modes of worship, and leisure activities they carried with them, to name just a handful of the southern cultural forms whose proliferation in northern cities during these decades antagonized long-term residents, were commonly perceived as lower-class attributes and behaviors, and made southern white migrants frequent objects of derision, as well as targets of state intervention, discipline, and reform. For their own part, rural Southerners brought a wariness about urban industrial life that often made them reluctant converts to the metropolitan social orders they came to move within. In neighborhoods like Chicago's Uptown, Dayton's East End, and Muncie's South Side, as well as working-class suburbs like Hazel Park, Michigan, or South Lebanon, Ohio, they lived with and around other people of similar backgrounds, formed their own churches, social clubs, and other communal institutions, and danced and got drunk with other people like them. Most of all, they maintained powerful attachments to the southern countryside itself and to the family members and communities they had left behind there. Rural white Southerners in the Midwest returned to the South at significantly higher rates than both black Southerners and white Southerners who migrated to other parts of the country during the mid-20th century, and as a result, many came to lead lives that were in meaningful ways suspended across both rural and urban and northern and southern settings. They returned on weekends between work shifts, to celebrate holidays, prepare for the birth of a child, or help navigate family emergencies, when layoffs sent them packing or when the hurly-burly of the city had simply become too much for them. Even those who had made permanent relocations to the urban Midwest, who managed to secure steady work and who raised families in circumstances that far exceeded what they had known from their rural upbringings, often retained such connections to the places they had come from. "I always planned on coming back," was how Wesley Reagan thought about it. By the early 1960s, just as he and Lula were starting their family in Dayton, Wesley had already managed to set aside enough money out of his wages to buy a small piece of land in Fentress County, Tennessee, outside of Jamestown. He and Lula would visit it regularly, preparing for the time they would move there for good. They left Ohio in 1985, on the very day Wesley retired from GM. The back-and-forth circuits charted by white Southerners like Wesley would be one of the defining characteristics of this decades-long migration. For a population that often set out from their native region in response to some sort of economic compulsion, because the farm went under, or the mine closed down, or simply because, as Wesley put it about growing up in his corner of rural Tennessee, you just wasn't going to be able to make a living here. The ability to return, whether periodically or permanently, represented a limited yet nonetheless powerful kind of agency. It meant having a say over the terms on which they accepted new forms of work, adjusted to new living environments, embraced new customs and cultures, or didn't. At the same time, the regularity with which such migrants returned to the southern countryside became one of the most frequently invoked charges against them during these years, a reason, in the eyes of others, to question their reliability as workers, their suitability as neighbors, even their fundamental ability to be integrated into the mainstream of American life. And so as these patterns of movement crisscrossed the rural Upper South and the urban Midwest, they both drew together and set apart the communities of displaced white Southerners and their families and descendants that lay along the interregional footprint of the Hillbilly Highway. No longer fully enmeshed in the distinctive life ways of the southern countryside, not entirely embedded in the urban industrial milieu in which they sought out work, the complexly interwoven networks of kith and kin that stretched across this broad portion of the American heartland, a region we might think of conjointedly as Transappalachia, became the terrain of a new and distinctive white working-class experience in 20th century American life. The story of that region, and the people who brought it into being, is what follows here. Hillbilly Highway is a book about the Transappalachian migrations in print on the social, cultural, and political map of recent American history. As such, it addresses itself first and foremost to a rather significant gap in the otherwise impressive body of literature that has been produced on the 20th century migrations out of the American South. All told, nearly 20 million white and black Southerners and another roughly 1 million Southerners of Mexican and Hispanic descent left the region and headed north and west during these decades. The story of the Black Great Migration is well known. So well known, in fact, that today it stands alongside the 19th century migrations of westering homesteaders as one of the heroic grand narratives of American history, a transformational passage out of the darkness of the South's blighted past of bondage, disenfranchisement, segregation, and racial terrorism. Over the last 3 or 4 decades, a small library of exemplary works of scholarly and popular history, not to mention numerous television documentaries, major museum exhibitions, and other high-visibility forms of cultural recognition, have been produced about the Great Migration. This stands to reason. The Great Migration represented the most profound shift in racial demography at any moment in the country's past, one that would turn a population that at the beginning of the 20th century was still overwhelmingly rural and nearly 85% concentrated in the states of the Old South into the most densely urbanized population group in modern America. The Great Migration forever altered black work roles and cultural identities, and, by facilitating their entrance into the emergent city-based political alliances of the 20th century, ensured that black Americans would become the most enduring members of the democratic coalitions of the New Deal and post-New Deal eras. The mid-century exodus of white farmers from the southern Great Plains to the far west, and especially California, was not quite so epical. Yet it has nonetheless occupied a similarly prominent place in the American cultural imaginary, thanks in large part to the Depression-era symbolic significance invested in so-called Okies fleeing the twinned environmental and economic calamity of the Dust Bowl by the likes of Woody Guthrie, Dorothea Lange, John Steinbeck, and John Ford. The Okie migration would outlast its Dust Bowl origins, only growing stronger as California rode the wave of World War II-era military spending to become an economic powerhouse, and transplanted white Southerners continued to flood into booming defense suburbs throughout the Cold War decades. This westward corollary to the Hillbilly Highway has also received significant historical attention in recent years, especially as scholars have looked to California in its politically ascendant white lower middle class for the origin stories of the post-war New Right. The same cannot be said about the Transappalachian migration, even though the number of white Southerners who migrated to the urban industrial Midwest roughly equaled those who ended up on the West Coast, and outnumbered all black migrants out of the South by some 2 or 3 million. There are shelves worth of country music songs about the Hillbilly Highway, at least one woefully underappreciated literary masterpiece about the migration, and, most unfortunately, J.D. Vance's best-selling poverty-shaming memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, published in 2016 and remade as a risible star vehicle by Netflix in 2020. But there is no Grapes of Wrath or Invisible Man, no migrant mother on a postage stamp. Likewise, the scholarship in this migration has been both more limited than in the other 2 instances and generally narrower in scope. In the last 25 years, there has been only one historical monograph written about the Southern Appalachian migration to the Midwest. Chad Berry's Southern Migrants, Northern Exiles, 2000, is a deeply sympathetic account of this history. Berry's grandfather was himself a migrant along the Hillbilly Highway, and it excels in its ability to allow participants in the migration to speak for themselves and to become authors of their own identities, thanks especially to the scores of oral histories the author either conducted or consulted in his research. But Berry spends comparatively less time situating the migration experiences he gathers within the context of larger histories of economic growth and decline, class formation and conflict, the changing racial composition of American cities, and the overarching political transformations of the period. As a result, Southern migrants, Northern exiles, has relatively little to say about how the Transappalachian migration impacted the broader terrain of American society during these years. The only more recent work of historical scholarship to address the migration in an extended fashion, James Gregory's The Southern Diaspora, How the Great Migrations of Black and White Southerners Transformed America, 2005, does considerably more in this last regard. But Gregory's book is largely synthetic in nature and explicitly comparative by design. Leaning heavily on the pre-existing scholarship about the Southern Great Migrations, including Gregory's own pioneering earlier work on the Okie migration to California, The Southern Diaspora necessarily reproduces that literature's strengths and weaknesses. Detailed and eloquent on how the arrival of black Southerners reconfigured the racial, cultural, and political landscapes of northern and western cities, equally persuasive on how white Southerners helped turn California into an unlikely bellwether of the new conservatism, it relegates Transappalachian migrants to an only tertiary role in the grand dramas of recent American history. These are oversights that Hillbilly Highway sets out to correct. A core contention in what follows is that Transappalachian migrants were at the center of many of the defining events of the period, from the country's explosive industrial development around the turn of the 20th century to the rise of the modern industrial labor movement during the 1930s and 1940s, from the unfolding of the post-war urban crisis to the decisive political realignments that transpired over the course of the 1960s and 1970s. Furthermore, looking at these events through the lens of the Transappalachian migration often forces us to reconsider some of our core preconceptions about them. Most accounts of the early years of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, for instance, locate the Midwestern labor movement's roots in the radical political traditions cultivated by the region's polyglot immigrant working classes. Southern white migrants are generally absent from such narratives, and when and where they do appear, they are often dismissed out of hand for their conservative tendencies, for their staunchly anti-union cultural dispositions, for lacking class consciousness. But upon closer examination, Transappalachian migrants were early and eager supporters of Midwestern industrial unions in both radical hotbeds like Detroit and more provincial outposts like Muncie. Similarly, most histories of the post-war urban crisis hardly mention the so-called hillbilly ghettos that began cropping up in the Midwestern cities like Chicago and Cincinnati during the decades after World War II. Yet these suddenly ubiquitous enclaves of poor white Southerners shaped contemporary thinking about the causes and consequences of urban poverty no less profoundly than did the zones of concentrated black and brown poverty they appeared alongside, and even came to play a pivotal role in the design and implementation of the War on Poverty, post-war liberalism's most ambitious, if flawed, social policy initiative. The point here is not simply to find traces of the Hillbilly Highway where others have not bothered to look. Historians have largely accepted at face value contemporary presumptions that transplanted white Southerners were constitutionally disinclined to challenge their employers' authority and join in solidaristic activity with other kinds of workers. As a result, we have failed to consider not only the many instances in which their actual behavior departed from such expectations, but also why it so frequently did. How did the material conditions that confronted natives of the rural Upper South during these years also influence the complex movement culture of the country's powerful industrial unions? Why did the persistence of Southern, rural, and working-class identities and cultural habits in the communities these migrants formed in the urban Midwest appear for a time to pose such an irreconcilable challenge to the expectations of mid-century consumer society? How did they figure in the intellectual debate about the relationship between racial identity, cultural inheritance, and social class that preoccupied social scientists and policymakers in the post-war decades? And what did that reveal about growing tensions between more elite interests in the liberal New Deal coalition and the poor and working-class whites who made up its social base? More often than not, the key to these and other questions lay in the circuitries of my...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?